While there's an argument to be made that bigger doesn't always mean better, today we're mostly just concerned with getting into the biggest of the big. Open world maps, that is. Whether you're zipping across the landscape in a driving game or trekking for miles atop your horse in a western adventure, there's plenty of reasons for video game maps to get particularly huge. While things are inevitably set to get a little muddy once we start talking about games that use procedural generation for their maps, we've done our best to get these out in order. That said, please head to that comment section if you think we've omitted a gigantic open world. I'm Jess from WhatCulture, and here are the 10 biggest open world maps in video games. Number 10. Test Drive Unlimited 2, 618 square miles. An early honorable mention to the worlds of Just Cause 3 and Death Stranding, because though they are absolutely and definitely gigantic game worlds, we're starting out big. Eden Games crafted the absolutely massive open world racing game Test Drive Unlimited 2 on the Havoc engine. It takes place across a pile of roads strewn across the island of Oahu, which returns from the original game, as well as Ibiza. Both locations were modeled using satellite data, and the entirety of the roads in the game tipped upwards of 1,860 miles across 618 square miles of map. The game, which was originally released in 2011, still offers players a world far larger to race around in than almost anything else that's been released since. If you're gonna put unlimited in the name, you'd better deliver, and it's safe to say that's exactly what they did. Impressively, despite being over 10 years old, the map for Test Drive Unlimited 2 is still 30 times bigger than that of Forza Horizon 4, for instance. Of course, it's not nearly as pretty, but that's an awful lot of map. Number 9. Final Fantasy XV, 700 square miles. Final Fantasy XV is a game that has gigantic swords and a boss who measures 800 feet across, so it stands to reason it'd have a pretty darn big map. And it does. Square Enix's 2016 entry into the long-running franchise offers up the biggest explorable world in the series so far. The game takes place within the world of Eos, which is divided up into 4 nations on 2 continents. You can make your way through the game on foot or atop a handsome chocobo if you like, but you'll probably want to opt for your sweet ride, the Regalia. Admittedly, some areas on the map are made impassable by mountainous terrain, and the game received some flack for the sparsity of some of the traversable areas. While including the non-traversable regions, we're talking about 750 square miles of map. Take those out and you've still got 700 square miles of map, which is a lot. Unlike some of the other games on this list that focus mainly on one mechanic and build a giant emptier world around that because the genre allows for it, Final Fantasy XV also needed to build meaningful narrative elements, compelling relationships between its characters, and a nuanced RPG and combat system. With all that considered, the size of the game world is extra impressive. Number 8. Asheron's Call, 500 to 800 square miles. There's some disagreement over exactly how big the high fantasy MMORPG world of Asheron's Call is, but either way, it's big enough to get a spot on our list. The game was created by Turbine Entertainment Software back in 1999 and is set in Dareth, an enormous island continent. There are also archipelagos around the primary landmass, if for some insane reason you feel like the central area just isn't big enough for you. Though the servers for the fan-favorite MMO were sadly shut off in 2016, in its heyday it hosted thousands of players at once. The seamless multiplayer virtual world was an anomaly for its sheer size, but its success in offering intriguing RPG and narrative elements kept players coming back as long as they were able. Number 7. Ghost Recon Breakpoint, 781.9 square miles. Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon Breakpoint is the 11th entry in Ubisoft's long-running franchise. It also happens to have a ridiculously huge map, but, and you're gonna see a pattern forming here, this is another case where bigger may not have necessarily meant better. The map covers the fictional island of Aroa in the South Pacific and sits at approximately 781.9 square miles of traversable terrain, including forestland, swamps, mountainous regions, and deserts. Interestingly, the game was designed for the player to use the map in order to find mission locations, so you'll have to compare a mission description to the regions instead of just chasing objective markers. With a lot of ground to cover, there's also a lot for you to do, like harvest resources, set up shelters, and craft items, as there's a far bigger emphasis on the survival gameplay aspects this time around. Also shooting, you'll still be doing a lot of shooting. Number 6. The Crew, 1900 square miles. We have back-to-back Ubisoft entries here as the crew comes in at our second biggest racing game, as it's a recreation of the entire United States. Scaled down, of course. Before its release in 2014, the crew's enormous game world coming in at just under 2,000 square miles was a massive selling point for the driving game. Of course, when you're covering ground at the speed of a souped-up vehicle, you need an awfully big game world to play around in. Included in its sprawling traversable world are 7 major cities, over 1,000 real-world landmarks, and approximately 10,000 kilometers of roads. Reportedly, driving from New York to LA in a super speedy car will take you around 45 minutes. The free roam gameplay and multiplayer elements were big draws for players who wanted to speed around with their mates. The map size of 2018's The Crew 2 is pretty much just as big as it is in The Crew, but this time you can get around on a plane so it doesn't feel as big. Number 5. Fuel, 5,600 square miles. The Crew may be massive, but there is one more racing game on this list that tops it in the size stakes, and that's Asobo Studios' 2009 racer Fuel. If Asobo Studio is setting off warning bells for you in the realm of really big video game maps, it should be, and we'll get to that further down the list. For now though, let's talk Fuel. This one takes place on an open world map that was unfathomably big at the time it was made, and still hasn't been topped in the racing genre. It covers approximately 5,600 square miles in a true exercise of ensuring quantity and hoping quality would follow. If it succeeded at that or not is in the eye of the beholder, but what cannot be debated is that Asobo managed an incredible feat in providing a world this big with no loading screens. Players will encounter all kinds of crazy weather conditions, it is the post-apocalypse after all, as well as a day-night cycle that passes as they play. It's worth mentioning that the map for Fuel is procedurally generated, so your mileage may vary as far as the map goes, pun totally intended. That said, there is 10,000 miles of road for you to travel down here, so it's gonna keep you pretty busy. Number 4, The Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall, 62,000 square miles. It totally makes sense for a massively multiplayer game or one featuring super fast vehicles to need a gigantic map, which makes it all the more impressive that one of the biggest maps on this list, and in gaming in general, is for a single-player RPG. And not just any single-player RPG, a single-player RPG from 1996. And yet, it's still one of the biggest maps ever made. If anyone was going to pull this off, it would be Bethesda, and that's just what they did with their procedurally generated map for Daggerfall, the second game in the Elder Scrolls series. This one is far larger than any other game in the series, coming in at 62,000 square miles. While main quest locations were handcrafted, as were many elements that made up the sprawling regions of High Rock and Hammerfell and Tamriel, procedural generation allowed the world to really feel like an expansive fantasy place primed for exploration. And it's a world worth exploring, with critically acclaimed RPG mechanics and deep questing pathways that revolutionize the genre. Number 3, Microsoft Flight Simulator, 196 million square miles. I'm gonna be honest, from here on out, there's probably gonna be some disagreement over what classifies as an open world game map. In this case, the open world game is the entire 196 million square mile planet Earth. So yeah, this is a big one. Microsoft Flight Simulator was released in 2020 by Asobo Studio. Yes, that Asobo Studio, the one who made Fuel 11 years prior. As the name implies, Microsoft Flight Simulator will have you piloting planes around the globe, between any number of its 37,000 airports, all of which actually exist. The game uses pretty clever technology to create its game world by simulating real satellite data and even weather data to reflect real-time weather in the actual world, translated to your little digital version. Real-world air traffic is also simulated. To put it plainly, this game was a slam dunk with critics and fans, in no small part due to the incredible effort put into its enormous map. And yes, because this is indeed a simulation of the entire Earth, you can in fact fly to your house. Number 2, Minecraft, 1.5 billion square miles. While Minecraft doesn't cover the entire globe, it is still vastly bigger than Microsoft Flight Simulator, and that's because of our old friend, procedural generation. While it's tricky to determine the game's precise size due to the way the map is created, it's safe to just go with freaking enormous and call it a day. The environment is generated as you move, and generated maps are unique, so your newly created world won't be a carbon copy of anyone else's. Everything may be made out of blocks, but there are blocks for snow, for rainforest, stone, and just about every other environment you can imagine. Microsoft is supposed to be this sandbox playground environment, so it's safe to say you won't be encountering any boundaries about how much or where you want to explore. Number 1. The Final Frontier. Elite Dangerous, No Man's Sky, space games in general. Millions of cubic light years. And finally, the games that are just way bigger than any other kind of game is ever going to be or be able to be. Space games, especially procedurally generated space games. Now, while each of these games definitely deserve their time in the sun, it's important to note that we need to put them all in one entry, because if we gave them their own entries, no other game is getting a look in on this list. That's because these things are huge. How huge, I hear you ask? You just covered Minecraft, and that was like 1 billion miles of game map. Well, in the case of space, we have to start talking volume. And we're talking about game areas big enough to be traversed by spacecrafts traveling at light speed. Chris Roberts said Star Citizen's playable area is 1 million by 1 million kilometers by 200 kilometers high. Meanwhile, Elite Dangerous is estimated to be about 13.8 cubic light years of traversable space. And the procedurally generated universes of Spore and No Man's Sky are pretty much immeasurably gargantuan. Almost all of these games require enormous maps to cater to the design of the game and massively multiplayer elements, and it's telling that the vast majority of them are beloved by fans and critics alike. Now, there is the argument to be made about how much these space games are filled with empty space or just filler environments, but if we're looking at the raw numbers, the space games have it. That's the end of our list, but do let me know down in that comment box if you can think of any other absolutely enormous games for our list. As always, I've been Jess from WhatCulture. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. If you like, you can come say hi to me on my Twitter account where I'm @JessMcDonald, but make sure you stay tuned to us here for plenty more gaming goodness.